Ex-military helps canine German Shepherd give birth. Minutes later, something heartbreaking happens. The rain came down in sheets, carving ghostly rivers through the dirt paths of Pine Hollow Ridge. Trees groaned under the weight of wind, their branches slashing against each other like tired old soldiers reliving forgotten wars. Inside a weather-beaten cabin tucked between the trees, Jake Carter sat hunched over a dimly lit fireplace, a steaming mug of black coffee clutched between hands calloused by war and time. The cabin was simple: wooden beams, dusty windows, a half-working radio that only picked up the Weather Channel. Jake liked it that way. Quiet, predictable, a place where the world couldn't ask anything more of him. After all, hadn't he already given enough? 4 tours overseas, a knee full of shrapnel, a heart full of memories too heavy to speak aloud. Hero, they'd called him. But he didn't feel like one. Not since he came back to silence, to emptiness, to no one waiting at the door. Tonight, though, something felt different. The storm wasn't just noise, it was pressure, a pulse pressing in on his bones. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. Then he heard it, a sharp, panicked yelp, muffled by the wind, but undeniable. It wasn't the cry of a wild animal. It was purposeful, desperate. Jake was on his feet before the mug hit the floor and shattered. He grabbed his coat from the hook, slipped into his boots, and flung the cabin door open. Rain slapped him in the face, cold and merciless. He didn't care. He followed the sound, limping through the brush, flashlight cutting jagged lines through the trees. There, by the fallen birch near the edge of the ridge, was a shape, a German Shepherd, collapsed, belly round and heaving, muzzle flecked with mud and foam. Her eyes found his, wide with pain and something else: trust. "Easy, girl," Jake murmured, crouching beside her. She didn't growl, didn't flinch. She was too far gone for fear. "You're not alone. I've got you." His hands moved on instinct, calm pressure against her flank, steady breath, years of combat trauma training snapping back to life. But this wasn't a comrade in uniform. This was a creature fighting to deliver life in the middle of a storm that wanted to bury her in darkness. Jake scooped her up with effort, ignoring the stab of his knee, and carried her back through the woods, the dog shuddering in his arms with every contraction. When he reached the cabin, he laid her gently on a pile of towels near the fire and scrambled to gather whatever he could: a pair of scissors, thread, warm water, rags. He'd never delivered a litter in his life, but he did that night. 6 puppies, tiny trembling things the size of his palm. Their cries were faint, but they were there, alive. Jake worked through the hours, wiping them clean, helping them nurse, coaxing the mother with soft words and warm hands. She met his gaze once, and in her eyes he saw it: gratitude. And then, with a final exhale, her head dropped. "Hey," he said, voice cracking. No, don't do this." But it was too late. She was gone. Jake sank beside her, soaked in sweat and grief. The storm outside began to fade, but the storm inside him roared louder. He rested his hand on her still chest, shaking his head. "You did good, girl," he whispered. "You held on long enough." The puppies whimpered and squirmed against her side, seeking warmth that was no longer there. That was the moment something shifted. Jake Carter had been many things in his life: soldier, survivor, shell of a man. But tonight, for reasons he couldn't explain, he felt something unfamiliar rise inside him. A need, a duty, not from orders barked through radios or scribbled in government briefing zones. This was different. He grabbed his phone from the counter and hesitated. Then he scrolled through old contacts until he found her name: Emily Hayes. They hadn't spoken in years. Last time he saw her, they were patching up a fellow soldier behind a dusty Humvee, arguing over the best way to keep him from bleeding out. She'd left the military after that, traded the chaos of war zones for a quieter life patching up animals. He hit the call button. The line rang once, twice. "Jake?" Her voice came, groggy and surprised. "Is that you?" "I need your help," he said simply. "It's urgent." He told her everything in short, clipped words. Emily didn't hesitate. "I'll be there in 20. When she arrived, drenched from the storm but focused as ever, she took one look at the puppies and nodded. "Let's get to work." They stayed up all night feeding them with droppers, warming them with heated towels, massaging their tiny bodies to mimic their mother's care. One of them, a little gray runt with a crooked tail, barely moved. His breathing was shallow, his tongue barely touched the formula. "Come on, little guy," Jake muttered, cradling the pup against his chest. "Not today." "You always did have a soft spot," Emily said quietly, not unkindly. "I've buried too many good ones," Jake replied. "I'm not losing him too." They worked in silence, the only sound the ticking of the clock and the soft whimpers of new life. Morning came slowly, sunlight cutting through the last of the storm clouds. 5 puppies slept curled in a bundle of warmth. The 6th, gray runt, crooked tail, still fought, but he was breathing. Jake didn't sleep that day. He stayed by their side, wiping their noses, checking their weight, trying to recall every piece of training he could adapt to this fragile, utterly new battlefield. By the second day, the runt had a name, Ace, and Jake had something he hadn't felt in a long time. Purpose. He didn't notice the man arrive until he heard boots on the cabin porch. Jake opened the door cautiously, tension curling through his shoulders. The man was older, dressed in a faded bomber jacket. In his hand was a water-damaged photo of the dog. "Kira," the man said softly. "Her name was Kira. I served with her once. Saved my life. They threw her out after she got injured. I tried to find her, but I was too late, wasn't I?" Jake didn't answer. He didn't need to. The man looked past him at the puppies in the basket. "I'm not here to take anything," he said. "Just wanted to see her one last time and ask if you'll look after them in her name." Jake stared at him for a long moment, then nodded. "I already am." And as the stranger left, disappearing down the muddy path, Jake sat back down beside the fire, where 6 tiny souls dreamed against each other. And for the first time in years, Jake Carter didn't feel broken. He felt needed, and that was enough to begin again. Sleep became a distant memory in the days that followed. The kind of sleep Jake Carter once knew, the deep, dreamless kind that visited soldiers after 40-mile treks and sleepless nights under foreign skies, was replaced by a restless awareness. A rhythm built not by patrol rotations or perimeter checks, but by the tiny cries of 6 orphaned puppies who had no one else in the world but him. The cabin was no longer quiet. It pulsed with fragile life. The nights were filled with the high-pitched squeaks of hungry mouths and the soft rustling of paws seeking warmth. Jake moved between them like clockwork, bottle-feeding each pup with practiced hands, learning their quirks and personalities. One had a stubborn kick. Another always finished her milk first. And Ace, the runt, remained his greatest worry. Smaller than the others, he struggled to latch on, often tiring before he could get enough nourishment. Jake kept him wrapped in an old flannel shirt tucked into his chest, heart pressed close to the tiny heartbeat he wasn't willing to lose. "You're not giving up, you hear me?" he'd whisper during the long, cold watches of the night. "You're not going out like this." Emily became a constant presence, her visits regular and grounding. She brought proper formula, supplements, and a portable heating pad that became the puppy's sanctuary. She'd sit cross-legged on Jake's living room floor, her blonde hair tied in a loose braid, gently rubbing their bellies to stimulate digestion, her voice soft and certain as she coached Jake through each step. "You're a natural," she said one afternoon, glancing at him over a squirming pup in her lap. Jake shook his head with a dry laugh. "I can barely take care of myself. Now I've got a whole squad of fuzzballs relying on me." "Well," she smiled, "they don't seem to mind." Her presence reminded him of their days in the field, her calm in chaos, her way of softening the blow of things too hard to name. She never asked about the things he carried, never asked why he chose isolation over connection. She just showed up. And in the silent language of those who've survived together, that was enough. The days passed in a blur of feeding times, weigh-ins, and bathroom breaks. The storm had passed, but Jake remained inside, tethered to the fragile lives unfolding in front of him. The cabin transformed. Blankets were laid out across the wooden floor, a scale sat near the fireplace. In a notebook, Jake's meticulous tracking log detailed every ounce gained or lost. He didn't know why he cared so much, but he did, deeply, obsessively, especially for Ace. Every time the smallest pup whimpered, Jake was there, warming a towel, preparing a bottle, rubbing his back when he struggled to breathe. "You've got fire in you," Jake whispered one night, holding Ace to his chest as the other slept in a tangle of legs and dreams. Just like your mom. He often thought about her, Kira. He didn't know her, not really, but he knew her type, loyal to the end, the kind of soul who would have taken a bullet without hesitation if it meant saving the team. He saw it in the way she held on until her pups were safe. Saw it in the strength that lived on in their tiny frames, especially in Ace, who refused to give up even as his body betrayed him. Then came the scare. It was just before dawn, the first rays of light slipping through the cabin's narrow window panes, when Jake noticed Ace hadn't moved in over an hour. The others stirred, suckling and stretching, but Ace lay still, limp and quiet. Jake's stomach turned to ice. No, 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 he muttered, scooping the pup up and pressing him against his chest. Come on, buddy, breathe. There was a moment of sickening silence, then a faint gasp, a twitch of his paw, a tiny rattling breath. Jake exhaled so hard it hurt. He placed Ace on a warm towel and rubbed his sides gently, rhythmically. Stay with me, he whispered. You're not done yet. Emily arrived within minutes of his call, her hair still damp from a rushed shower, eyes wide with concern. She examined Ace with care, her brow furrowed as she listened to his heartbeat. It's weak, she said quietly. But he's fighting. So am I, Jake replied. They worked together without words, as they once had on battlefields, hands steady even as fear coiled in their chests. For hours they coaxed Ace back from the brink. And when he finally let out a strong, determined yelp, Jake let his shoulders slump and laughed. Not out of amusement, but out of sheer exhausted relief. That's it, he said, pressing a kiss to the top of Ace's head. That's my boy. As the sun climbed higher, bathing the cabin in golden light, the other pups napped peacefully, unaware of the war fought on a wool blanket just feet away. Emily leaned back against the wall, her eyes glassy but smiling. You're doing more than surviving out here, Jake. You know that, right? He nodded slowly, eyes fixed on Ace curled up in his palm like a promise kept. I'm trying, he said, and they're giving me a reason to. And that night, when the wind whispered through the trees and the forest held its breath, Jake sat beside the fire, Ace nestled beneath his chin, and allowed himself to believe, for the first time in a long while, that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't lost after all. The morning came gently, unlike the days before. The storm had passed, leaving behind a sky so blue it felt like an apology. Sunlight filtered through the trees and spilled across Jake's cabin floor, casting long golden fingers over sleeping puppies and the cluttered remnants of survival. Towels, bottles, heat pads, and a stack of notes Jake had started keeping, scribbled observations about each pup. Ace lay curled beneath Jake's flannel, rising and falling with every breath Jake took, as if the bond they'd formed went deeper than instinct, closer to something elemental. Jake sat on the porch, coffee in hand, the scent of pine and wet earth heavy in the air. For the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to feel a quiet kind of peace. Not joy, not yet, but peace, like the space between battles, when your boots finally stopped moving and the silence didn't feel like guilt. That's when he heard the footsteps, slow, deliberate, crunching along the gravel path that cut through the woods and led straight to his door. Jake rose, cautious but not alarmed. These woods didn't get visitors, not unless they were lost or looking for something. The man who emerged from the tree line was older, in his late 50s, maybe early 60s. He wore a bomber jacket worn thin at the elbows, dark jeans and boots that had seen more roads than most men could count. His face was weathered like someone who'd spent a lifetime in wind and war, and his eyes held the quiet weight of regret. Jake tensed slightly, one hand resting on the porch railing. Can I help you, Eddie called. The man stopped a few feet away, nodded once. I think you already did, he said, voice gravelly, thick with something unspoken. Jake narrowed his eyes. Do I know you? The man stepped closer, holding out a photograph, faded, edges curled with age. Jake took it. The image was blurry but unmistakable. A German shepherd, tongue lolling, sitting beside a younger version of this man. The same eyes, same build, same sorrow. And in the corner of the photo, scribbled in blue ink, a name, Kira. Jake's heart twisted. That's her, he said quietly. She came to me in the storm, pregnant. She made it long enough to give birth. Then she was gone. The man swallowed, jaw clenched. I figured as much. When I heard rumors, heard there was a shepherd found near these woods, I had to know, I had to see. He took a breath like it hurt. Her name was Kira. We served together. I was her handler for nearly 4 years. He paused, blinking against the sunlight. She saved more lives than most men I knew. Once pulled me out of a minefield in Afghanistan. Didn't think twice, but she got injured on a mission. They said she was done. Damaged goods. She didn't pass the recert, so they retired her. Just like that. No ceremony. No thanks. They wouldn't even let me take her home. His voice broke a little, and he cleared his throat. She was sent to a civilian placement program. After that, I lost her. Tried to find her. Tried everything. But it was like she vanished. Jake's gaze dropped to the photo again. She didn't vanish. She found her way here, and she fought like hell to make sure her pups had a chance. The man's eyes glistened. Sounds like her. Always the fighter. Jake opened the cabin door and gestured for the man to follow. Inside, the warmth of the fire still lingered. 5 puppies slept curled in a blanket-lined crate. Ace, ever stubborn, was awake and chewing gently on the corner of a washcloth. Jake knelt beside him, scooping the runt into his hand. "This one," he said, "nearly didn't make it, but he's got her fire. I named him Ace." The man crouched slowly, his gaze locking onto the pup. He reached out, hand trembling slightly, and let Ace sniff his fingers. The little dog leaned into the touch, eyes bright with curiosity. "Kira used to do that," the man murmured. "Always tested a person's soul through their scent." He looked up. "You did right by her." Jake sat back against the wall, exhaustion creeping in again. "I didn't know what I was doing. Still don't. But I wasn't going to let her die for nothing." "She didn't," the man said. "Not even close." For a long moment they sat in silence, the only sound the soft breathing of puppies and the occasional crackle of firewood. Then the man reached into his coat and pulled out a small dog tag, worn, scratched, but clearly treasured. He handed it to Jake. It read, "Kira, M.O.D. number 21498. If found, return to base." "I kept it," he said. "They let me keep it when they discharged her. Figured she should have it near her somehow." Jake looked down at the tag, then back at Ace. "She's still here," he said softly. "Through them." The man stood, slowly brushing dust from his knees. "I'm not here to take them. I don't deserve that. I wasn't there when she needed me." Jake looked up, brow furrowed. "She found her way. She made it to the one place someone would listen. That counts." The man gave a tired smile. "Then do me one favor. Name it. Raise them like she would have wanted. Teach them what she knew. Give them a life that honors what she gave." Jake nodded. "I will." The man hesitated at the door, looking back one last time. "Thank you, soldier." "Any time, brother," Jake replied. And then he was gone, swallowed by the trees, the same way he came. Jake turned back to the crate. The pups stirred now, one by one, waking, noses twitching, tails wagging sleepily. Ace let out a soft bark and nudged his way toward Jake's boot. Jake lifted him, settled him against his chest again, and looked around the cabin. Once a place of isolation, now brimming with life. He ran a hand over his face, still rough with stubble, eyes bleary but full of something new. Not just duty, not just survival, hope. He looked down at Ace, who blinked up at him with bright, stubborn eyes. "Looks like we've got a mission, kid," he said. "Let's make here proud." Outside, the forest stood still, but inside the cabin, everything had changed. Jake never thought a cabin could feel full again. Not since the day he shut the world out. Not since he buried his uniform beneath layers of silence and pine wood. But now every room buzzed with life. There was no more solitude, not when 6 tiny beings needed him more than they needed sleep. The days began before sunrise. Not with alarms or orders, but with yawns and squeaks and the patter of tiny paws tumbling over one another in a tangle of fur. Feeding time was a symphony of chaos. Bottles lined up, towels spread across the kitchen floor, and Jake hunched in the middle of it all like a soldier surrounded by hungry recruits. He'd given up counting the hours. Sleep came in snatches like old radio signals from a past life, but he didn't mind. There was something healing in the rhythm, something human. He hadn't realized how much he'd craved that. Emily continued to visit daily, sometimes bringing supplies, other times just showing up with that quiet determination of hers and a bag of takeout she knew Jake wouldn't bother to buy himself. They worked together like they always had in the field, without fanfare, without wasted words. There was a kind of peace in that too, but Ace, as always, demanded more. His appetite grew, but so did his defiance. He refused the bottle unless Jake fed him directly, nipped at his siblings with the stubbornness of someone who refused to be underestimated, and yelped the moment he wasn't the center of someone's attention. "He's going to be trouble," Emily said with a smirk, watching as Ace tried to scale the edge of the puppy crate, paws barely finding purchase. "He's going to be a leader," Jake replied, gently nudging the little rebel back into the warmth of his siblings. "Trouble usually is." It was during one of those quiet evenings, the pups finally asleep in their makeshift den by the fire, that Emily asked the question Jake had been trying to avoid. "What happens next?" He didn't answer right away. He stared into the flames, his hands resting on his knees, shoulders tense. "What do you mean?" he asked, though he knew exactly what she meant. "I mean the puppies," she said softly. "They'll open their eyes soon, they'll grow teeth, start exploring. Eventually they'll need more space. Training, structure, a future." Jake exhaled slowly. "I don't know." "You could find homes for them," she offered, voice neutral. "Good families, people who can raise them right." He looked down at Ace, curled beneath his hand. "Feels like giving away a piece of something sacred." Emily was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "They were born into purpose, just like their mother. Maybe it's not about keeping them. Maybe it's about preparing them." Her words echoed louder than the crackling fire. Jake thought of Kira, of the strength in her body as she pushed life into the world, with no one but a broken man and a dying storm to witness it. She hadn't hesitated. She'd simply done what needed to be done, just like a soldier, just like a mother. He nodded slowly. "I'm not ready to let them go. Not yet." Emily smiled, the corners of her eyes softening. "Then don't. Just make it count." The next day, Jake started building. He cleared the corner of the cabin that had once been reserved for collecting dust and memories. He laid down rubber mats, built low wooden barriers, set up play tunnels, and turned it into a training ground for future guardians. Every day, he worked with them, not just feeding and bathing, but teaching. Voice commands, clicker responses, basic instincts. It was slow, tedious, often frustrating work, but it was familiar. It was discipline and reward, strategy and patience. And as the weeks passed, the puppies began to thrive. Each had their own personality. One barked at her own reflection. Another loved to dig into the laundry pile like it was treasure. But Ace learned fastest. He watched Jake with a gaze that burned. He followed, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. He sat on command, came when called, and even began alerting Jake with a high-pitched whine if one of his siblings strayed too far. "He's got her eyes," Jake muttered one afternoon, staring down at the pup curled against his boot. Emily across the room nodded. "And her heart." One evening, as twilight painted the sky in streaks of orange and violet, Jake stood outside the cabin, watching the pups wrestle in the grass. The trees swayed in the breeze, whispering secrets only old souls understood. The air smelled of pine, earth, and second chances. The man who had visited weeks before, Kira's handler, had sent a package. Inside was a framed photo of Kira in uniform, eyes sharp, posture proud, and a short note written in careful print. "You're doing more than I ever could. Thank you." Jake hung the photo above the fireplace. The pups didn't notice, but Ace, when he sat in Jake's lap that night, lifted his head and looked at it, just for a moment, as if he knew. The nights grew quieter, the puppies grew louder. The cabin, once a place of ghosts, now pulsed with breath and barking and hope. Jake began to see himself not as a man in hiding, but as a man rebuilding. Each small success, Ace responding to his name, another pup mastering a command, was a brick laid in the foundation of something real. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was shaping life. One afternoon, Emily brought a clipboard filled with notes and applications. "People are hearing about the pups," she said. "A few veterans reached out. They're looking for service dogs." Jake froze. "Service dogs?" "Yeah, therapy, PTSD support, some even for mobility or alert training." The right homes, with the right guidance, these pups could change lives. He looked at her, eyes shadowed with the weight of understanding. They already have, she smiled. Then let's give them the chance to do it again. That night, Jake didn't sleep. He sat outside with Ace, the stars scattered above like forgotten prayers. The little dog nestled into his lap, warm and trusting. You were born in a storm, Jake whispered, brushing a hand over Ace's head. Your mom gave everything to get you here, and I think that means something. The pup blinked up at him, yawned, and curled tighter. Jake stared at the sky, the firelight flickering behind him, and felt something shift. He had lost so much. Friends, time, himself. But in the aftermath of all that loss, 6 tiny lives had pulled him back. Not with noise, not with medals, but with need, with warmth, with purpose. And in the shape of that purpose, he began to see the outline of the man he used to be, no longer broken, no longer running, just becoming. The morning sun filtered through the trees like molten gold, brushing the tops of the pines and soaking the world in a quiet, sacred glow. Jake Carter stood at the edge of the meadow behind his cabin, a place he used to visit only to be alone, to hide from the weight of his memories. But now it had become something different, a sanctuary where life had returned in the form of 6 bounding, barking, tumbling German Shepherd pups. They chased each other through the dew-slick grass, yipping and pouncing, discovering the world with fresh eyes and endless curiosity. Ace led the pack, of course, always 2 steps ahead, always looking back to make sure his siblings followed. He wasn't just growing, he was leading. Jake watched them with a hand wrapped around a chipped coffee mug and a heart he no longer recognized. It felt lighter now, not because the memories had faded, they hadn't, but because for the first time in years, they had room to sit beside something else. Hope. The sound of tires crunching gravel pulled his gaze toward the long dirt driveway. A truck appeared through the trees, followed by 2 others. Emily emerged first, clipboard in hand, hair tied back, smile soft but full of resolve. Behind her, 3 men and 2 women climbed out, nervous, curious, each of them carrying invisible weight in their eyes. Veterans, survivors, people like Jake. Jake walked forward slowly, nodding to each of them in turn. He didn't say much. He didn't need to. Pain recognized pain. Scars could see each other even when hidden beneath flannel shirts and faded jeans. This is where they've been raised, Emily said, gesturing toward the clearing. They've been socialized, trained, evaluated for temperament. Jake's done most of the work. The others looked to Jake, surprised, maybe even a little skeptical. But then the pups came bounding around the corner, tails wagging, eyes bright, and all doubt melted into wonder. The group knelt down, laughing, calling out, letting the pups sniff and tumble into their arms. Jake's breath caught in his throat as he watched. Each pup seemed to find the right person, as if guided by something deeper than chance. One nestled against a woman with trembling hands. Another sat perfectly still at the feet of a man who hadn't spoken a word. And Ace stayed back, watching it all unfold. Waiting. Jake stepped forward, crouching beside him. What do you think, partner? Ace tilted his head, then licked Jake's cheek and trotted off toward a young man in a wheelchair. The man reached out instinctively, and Ace placed a single paw on his knee, looking up with that same fire Jake had seen from day one. The man smiled, not just with his mouth, but with something deeper. Guess he picked me, he said. Jake nodded slowly. Yeah, he tends to do that. Over the next few hours, the meadow transformed into something between a reunion and a farewell. Papers were signed, instructions were given, tears were shed, laughter too. Emily moved between everyone like a conductor, making sure nothing was missed. Jake stayed near the edge, hands in his pockets, trying to prepare for what he knew was coming. Letting go. It was never the leaving that hurt, he realized. It was the silence afterward, the space where something once lived. He knelt down beside the crate where the last pup, a shy, gentle girl named Luna, waited to be carried into her new life. Her new owner, an older man who'd lost both legs in combat, stood beside them, his face a mixture of gratitude and uncertainty. Jake scooped her up gently and handed her over. She'll watch your back, he said. Just give her time. The man's eyes welled. Thank you, Jake, for everything. Jake didn't reply, just nodded and stepped back. One by one, the trucks pulled away, leaving Jake and Emily alone beneath the open sky. The meadow felt empty now. Not in a painful way, but in the way a home feels after a celebration. Quiet, still, echoing with warmth. Emily stepped beside him, slipping her hand into his. You okay? He stared at the road the trucks had taken. I don't know. They're going to change lives, she said. They already have, Jake replied. Mine included. She turned toward him, her eyes searching. You know you could have kept one. He smiled faintly. I did. She blinked. Ace? He shook his head. Purpose. Emily looked at him for a long moment, then smiled. You're not the same man I found in this cabin. I know, he said, but I'm finally the man I was supposed to become. Days passed, then weeks. The cabin grew quiet again, but not empty. Jake kept a framed photo of the pups on the mantel, beside Kira's tag, and a hand-carved wooden plaque that read, In her honor. He still woke early, still worked the land, but now he spent more time in town, helping at the shelter, volunteering at the local vet clinic, teaching obedience classes for dogs with difficult pasts. Word of what he'd done spread quietly, respectfully. Other veterans started reaching out, first for advice, then for companionship, then for something more. One morning, Jake walked out onto the porch and found a small crate resting beside the steps. Inside was a pup, skinny, shaking, eyes too old for its young face. No note, just a silent request. Jake didn't hesitate. He carried the pup inside, wrapped it in an old towel, and whispered, You're safe now. He didn't name it right away. He let the pup decide who it was going to be. The next few months unfolded like the early chapters of a new life. Jake trained, taught, healed. He watched his world expand one small life at a time. He didn't forget Kira. He couldn't. Her memory lived in every bark, every lesson, every soul she'd passed her fire into. One chilly autumn afternoon, a letter arrived in the mail. It was from the young man in the wheelchair, the one Ace had chosen. Inside was a photo. The man sat in his backyard, Ace beside him, both smiling like the world hadn't broken them. He saved my life, the note read, just like you said he would. Thank you, Jake, for giving me back something I thought I'd lost forever. Jake read the words 3 times, then he folded the letter, placed it beside Kira's tag, and sat quietly by the fire. He didn't cry. Not out of pride, but because the ache in his chest had been replaced by something else. Something warm, something whole. Outside, the wind moved through the trees like a whisper, but this time it didn't sound like grief. It sounded like her. And it said, You did good. Jake leaned back, a hand resting on the back of the sleeping pup at his feet, and let the silence wrap around him, not as a weight, but as peace. He had been a soldier, he had been lost. But now, in the most unexpected way, through the life of a dog who gave everything, in the fire she left behind in her son, he had found his way home.